Good evening. Welcome to the Equity and Preservation Panel discussion. This is the final presentation in Historic Preservation Month 2021. I hope you have enjoyed the previous discussions. And if you've missed any, please visit the Office of Historic Alexandria website, where you can view recordings of most of the presentations. Tonight, we'll have a panel discussion featuring three guests: John Sprinkle, Purvi Irwin, and Jaqueline Tucker. Through the month, we have focused on built environment. And for the final discussion, we'd like to shift our focus to the evolution of historic preservation to include the preservation of culture and community. Before we move on to our distinguished speakers, there are a few important housekeeping items to get out of the way. For the flow of the evening, we'll have a presentation for about 10 minutes for each speaker, then a question and answer of approximately 30 minutes or whatever we have left in our time tonight. Use the chat function at any time during the meeting this evening to enter your questions. Make sure that you post them to everyone. Let's try to keep this as a community feel. We want to make this a wide open discussion amongst panelists and the attendees tonight. And we are recording the program, and it'll be posted on the Historic Alexandria YouTube channel in coming weeks. Our first speaker tonight is John Sprinkle. After a decade in private sector consulting, John Sprinkle joined the National Park Service in 1998 and currently serves as the agency's bureau historian. He holds a PhD in American history from the College of William & Mary and is an adjunct associate professor in the School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at the University of Maryland. John is a member of the Alexandria Board of Architectural Review and the Historic Alexandria Foundation's Board of Directors. John will be discussing historic preservation and neighborhood conservation, specifically focusing on displacement, urban violence, and architectural survey in Alexandria. Take it away, John.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. Thank you, Bill. I begin tonight with a well-known Bible story and seek to apply it to the concepts of generational significance and the enhancement of the historic preservation practice in the third quarter of the 20th century. Like Saul, preservation practitioners after 1966 were confronted with new revelations about the nature, scope, and distribution of historic properties. And like Saul, what matters most is how the preservation community reacted once the scales fell from their eyes to a new appreciation for the diversity of American history. But first, a story from the old preservation. Prior to 1966, the historic preservation community often failed to consider the values of minority, ethnic, and low-income groups. And in some cases, racism was clearly at the core of the endeavor. In others, the impact of a segregated society was perhaps more nuanced. One of the most troublesome episodes centered around efforts to relocate Alexander Hamilton's home, the Grange, out of its Harlem neighborhood in New York City. Originally seated within a 32-acre estate, Hamilton Grange was moved for the first time in 1889 as Manhattan's urban grid reached 143rd Street. By the 1920s, the home had become surrounded, as you can see from on the right, had become surrounded by much larger structures that overwhelmed its setting. And in 1933, it was acquired by a regional preservation group and operated as a house museum. By 1950, the organization's leadership observed that, quote, the shifting character of the population around the Grange had substantially reduced its visitation. The society considered the environment disgraceful and completely unworthy of Hamilton's national stature. Others described the property as more like a slum than a shrine. Indeed, one author compared the site to Mount Vernon and Monticello, and eventually said that the Grange looked, quote, more like the former residence of Uncle Tom than the seat of a founding father. Congress assigned the Hamilton Grange question to the National Park Service in 1962, giving it two options: move it to a small city-owned parcel in Harlem, or transport it across Manhattan to reside next to another new NPS property, Grant's Tomb. Architectural historians strongly urged moving Hamilton Grange to the site overlooking the Hudson because it would provide an appropriate historical setting for the building where its architectural qualities could be appreciated within a reconstructed landscape. NPS Regional Director Ronald Lee reported in 1965, there was no question whatsoever in the minds of his professional staff that the Grant's Tomb site would be a vast improvement over relocating the building within Harlem. It was discovered that Hamilton had originally considered building his home near the proposed site, which enhanced a growing sentiment among thoughtful people that the Hudson River site provided a more appropriate setting. The New York City Landmarks Commission countered that Hamilton Grange could have been a great asset for renewing a deprived neighborhood that was entitled to special consideration. However, given the pragmatic considerations, the Grange, according to the commissioners, could never be much more than it is now. And in fact, city officials concluded that leaving the building in Harlem would be rather an insult to the memory of Alexandria Hamilton than a tribute. Using words like slum and Uncle Tom to describe the condition of the property were thinly veiled references to the African-American residents that predominated Harlem's neighborhood at the time. Urban unrest in the community, especially the 1964 Harlem riots, added to the bias against keeping the building in its original neighborhood. In the end, though, community efforts were successful in fostering the reconsideration of the site's removal out of the district. This led to a generation of patchwork restoration and preventative maintenance. Did Ronald Lee and the other preservation leaders recognize the irony of their efforts to remove a nationally significant resource from its historic associations with Harlem, just as the movement was advocating for another expansion of federal recognition programs with the National Historic Preservation Act in 1966? Clearly, some portions of the preservation community thought Harlem was exactly the wrong place for Hamilton Grange, preferring to reconstruct the estate and its landscape at a new site along the Hudson. Ironically, in 1966, the city's Landmark Commission asserted that within 5 years, the Grange would undoubtedly assume its proper significance and foster a revival of scholarly works and a great surge of popular interest in this somewhat forgotten founding father. The prediction was correct, only a generation too soon. As Ron Chernow's biography was published in 2004, the building was moved in 2008, reopened as a museum in 2011, and Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical adaptation opened in 2015 to wide acclaim. Perhaps you've heard of it. Now, while perhaps not as complex as Manhattan, the racial landscape of Alexandria also presented issues for its local preservation community. Following in the footsteps of the expanded National Register of Historic Places, City Council funded a comprehensive architectural study of the area between the Potomac River and the railroad and future metro right-of-way, with an eye towards expanding the boundaries of the 1946 Old and Historic District. Here, Alexandria's planners encountered a significant dilemma. With a stroke of a pen, the traditional boundaries of the historic district could be expanded, resulting not only in a substantial increase in economic activity, because there was considerable demand for restorable historic buildings at the time, but also at virtually no cost to the city's coffers. On the other hand, early back to the city advocates came to recognize that rehabilitation and adaptive use, while probably good for the resources and the local economy, also led to residential displacement of minority, elderly, and low-income tenants. As of the mid-1960s, urban renewal projects in Alexandria had displaced about 100 families, more than half of them African-American, whereas all of the 2,700 displaced families in Savannah, Georgia were Black. Often seen as a prescription for whatever currently ailed society, American historic preservation faltered at this period as it tried to address the cultural and economic implications of gentrification. To address this planning conundrum, Alexandria experimented with a new approach funded by the National Endowment for the Arts, known as neighborhood conservation. As with much of urban renewal, there was a distinct tone of paternalism within the neighborhood conservation projects. Across the country, a variety of design devices were proposed to revive a sense of ethnic character and identity. Pocket parks in Wilmington, Delaware, historic murals for Los Angeles, and walking tours in Roxbury, Massachusetts. In general, these plans failed to acknowledge the economic realities of landlord-tenant relations within a segregated society. They assumed that these long-standing communities had lost their cultural or ethnic identities, as evidenced by declining care of the aesthetic aspects of their urban landscape. Now, during the 1970s, historic preservation's role in revitalization was questioned within the ethnic and minority communities on a variety of fronts. Vincent DeForest, head of the Afro-American Institute for Historic Preservation and Community Development, asserted that few had bothered to question the degree to which preservation programs had contributed to the gentrification of urban neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. and its environs. New York Congressman Edward Pattison agreed, wondering about the impact on urban ethnic neighborhoods now that the slums are fashionable. And Rita McCurley, who established the Coalition for Human Preservation in her Baltimore neighborhood, an area that was a speculator's dream and a poor person's nightmare, characterized historic preservation as being more concerned with greed than with history, And that's a sentiment that was expanded in 1976 after the enactment of the historic rehabilitation tax credits. Within this environment, why did Alexandria choose to reject traditional historic preservation for a period of time in favor of an experiment with neighborhood conservation? Almost 51 years ago, on May 29, 1970, a George Washington High School junior named Robin Gibson was murdered at this 7-Eleven store in the Alexandria neighborhood. Shot by a clerk who then planted a knife on the young man to try and frame him for robbery, this event had significant ramifications throughout the city. Several weeks of protest followed, and a surge in voters elected the first African-American city council member since Reconstruction. As part of the unrest, several buildings were specifically targeted for firebombs. One, the newly established Robert E. Lee Boyhood Home House Museum, had obvious symbolism. Another was at the site of an ongoing rehabilitation project within Old Town. This attack confirmed the fears of many Alexandria lovers of historic homes that urban violence might descend upon the city's old and historic district. As much as we are taught in Alexandria to remember the Titans, we should also recall the impact of Robin Gibson's murder. Now, like Saul on the road to Damascus, each generation is presented with an opportunity to revitalize and rehabilitate the American narrative by deciding how the intangible values we have chosen to share are to be reflected in the tangible places and objects we choose to conserve and interpret for the next generation. In 1961, during the centennial of the American Civil War, heritage-minded individuals chose to nominate our state capital as a National Historic Landmark. Officially designated as the Confederate capital of Virginia, the name of this Thomas Jefferson designed Greek Revival temple was not revised until 2017. This generation's work is to identify, recognize, and reinterpret historic properties that present an enhanced view of Alexandria's past. Included in these efforts are an ongoing study to nominate another capital of Virginia, this one from 1863 to 1865, as a new National Historic Landmark. For it was this building, or in this building along Prince Street, is where loyal Virginians took action to abolish slavery in the Commonwealth during the height of the Civil War. Now is the time, as Frederick Douglass recommended, for Alexandrians to step on the train. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. So as I said at the beginning of the meeting this evening, please feel free to ask any questions. We will get to them at the end of the hearing, but please, as we go, just put them in the chat box, and I will keep an eye on that, and I'll make sure that we get those distributed after we've heard from all of our speakers. Next speaker this evening is Purvi Irwin. Purvi is an historic preservation architect who shifted from architecture to technology support about 5 years ago, after over a decade spent working with historic buildings in the Washington, D.C. area. She now supports technology related to the architecture, engineering, and construction fields, which includes software training, implementations, and troubleshooting. Purvi has served on the Board of Architectural Review since 2012, first on Parker Grade BAR, and now on the consolidated Alexandria BAR. She has recently become more involved in equity and diversity conversations as it relates to both the larger architectural, engineering, construction sphere, and more specifically around historic preservation principles. She loves to learn and teach with a strong belief that diversity in all ways creates stronger and more resilient communities. You can find her on Twitter at BIMCHIQ or on LinkedIn at www.linkedin.com in Purvi Irwin. Kirby is going to be discussing the new approaches to include diversity and inclusion in the preservation field while preserving our past for the future.
Thank you, John. That was, I think, a really great summary to get us going here. So the piece that I'm going to talk about is kind of how can we move preservation forward? How can we take preservation as it's done traditionally and move it into being more equitable, more diverse, more inclusive, and have more justice? So the term that I like to use is JEDI. I think it's a great term. It makes a great acronym. So the presentation I'm going to give here is a shorter version of a shorter and slightly altered version of a presentation I've given a couple times already, talking about some of the principles that I've learned over the past probably year or so after attending a variety of different lectures and symposiums and conferences related to preservation and diversity. So, and I think that all of these topics are really important, and I hope that the folks who are watching can join in on this conversation, because I think that, part of diversity is hearing as many voices as possible. So the first thing I want to mention are some of the points that we can think about as we evaluate how we practice historic preservation in the US. What is meaning? How does it come about? What are we saying by what we choose to include or exclude when we're preserving something? How can we broaden our criteria of what history is and time is to encompass all the different cultures that make up our country, right? Different cultures in our society look at history differently. And I think that we have to start kind of reevaluating what is history, what does that mean to all the different peoples that are here. So let's see. So the first thing is kind of the identity of place. So what is included when you think about the identity of a place? It's the people, is it the buildings, the memories, or the events that are happening in that place, right? The way that indigenous cultures typically think about culture is really different than the way that we think about it in the Western world. So that's something that we really have to think about. And we also have to think about that unconscious history of people. You aren't always aware of what you know because it's part of you and it's part of how you're raised. So everybody thinks about history differently because they come from a different place. And we have to find a way to expand and to think about that fully. So we have, I think, a very set idea of what this space and place is, and it doesn't really include these non-Western cultures. So here are some ideas that were shared in these presentations that I attended that are ways to evolve how we think about space and place and how it's important and it's valued. How do we remember and interpret sites that no longer are there or were intentionally hidden because, at the time it was LGBTQ spaces, which, weren't socially acceptable at the time. And so these spaces were intentionally hidden, things about that. What about events that are important to our history or the history of a particular group, right? So we need to think about not just tangible physical things, but also events, marches, rallies, riots, things that have created a lot of importance in our history. And I know right now in the news with the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Massacre, that's a big piece of our preservation history that I think, kind of talks to this part, talking about an event and in time that really had a huge impact on the history of our country. And that's where we're trying to get to, I think, is evolving this idea of historic preservation. So this slide, these words were from Jackson Loop, who presented at a conference that I was at last summer called the Dismantle Preservation Unconference. And it was all about thinking about preservation in a different way. And I thought that it was really powerful how, the mainstream preservation tools that we use right now tell really a very narrow story because they think about just the fabric, right? And it's a very kind of reductive and fixed way to think about preservation because it's reliant on just what's actually there. And, he noted that once you designate a building, it's really hard to criticize it or to kind of change it or access it. And that's partially what we need to do, right? We need to kind of think about how are different ways that we can nominate these buildings, how are different ways that we can go back over time and actually relook at why something was designated and see if there is a broader range of ideas that can contribute to that listing. So then, of course, an important part of history is the bad along with the good, right? We can't sanitize everything. We can't make everything be happy and cheerful. And I think that how we preserve that pain and that shame that's part of our history is just as important as, preserving all of it together. So why is it important? Why is it important that we need to be diverse? Well, our culture is by definition diverse, right? We are a nation of immigrants that come from all over the world that are in this place that wasn't even ours to begin with, right? So we have to think about how we encompass all of that. And it's this diversity that gives us strength. So I think that we need to all draw from that. We need to show everybody that they're important, right? Because pretty much, everybody, when you think about what do people want, people want to be heard, they want to be recognized, they want to know that they're important and they contribute. And so when you see your history being shared, being preserved, you see your place in the world, and it kind of helps to bring you up. So I think that that's an important thing, and we need to show all those cultures. It's kind of like when, Kamala Harris was elected. Now, finally, we said, okay, look, we can have a woman who is half Black, half South Asian as vice president. That means that someone who looks like me can do this. And now, you've now said there's importance in this, right? And where we come from really helps us to find our place in the world. So we want to make sure that we're thinking about all of these things when we're thinking about what we're going to preserve. So moving forward, here are some of the major considerations I think that I sort of pulled out from these things that I've been attending. What is meaning? How do we create meaning? What diverse narratives are being represented or excluded, and how can we broaden what's included? Who is participating in this process? So last week, the BAR and some other city staff went through a really great training where we had a really amazing presentation that talks about including people who are not part of the mainstream group, and really having them tell their own stories and creating partnerships with different groups so that everybody is telling their own story. Nobody should be telling someone else's story for them, right? You should have those people tell their own stories. And then how can we change our policies, right, and our processes to be more inclusive in our community? Those are all kind of things that we need to really think about. But of course, while we do it, we have to think about how we're going to do it, right? So a lot of what I've been working with is, since I'm an architect and I work a lot in the architecture, engineering, and construction sphere, there are a lot of the AEC firms out there have started putting together JEDI panels or diversity panels. And a lot of the burden on to kind of spearhead these and keep them going are actually put on those who are excluded. And so we have to think about how do we not increase the burden on those who are already burdened by giving them this responsibility. So it needs to be broader, right? How do we think about adding sites to our national registers, to our heritage lists? Just adding diverse sites is not important. We have to think about how this affects the larger community, because as we've said before, historic preservation has had a tendency to gentrify, and we need to try to figure out why that is and how we can prevent that from happening to keep our neighborhoods together. Of course, we need to look at our own history, make it inclusive, and again, telling that important story. Sometimes less happy. It's a skill that we all have to work on and learn. So this was from the training last week on how do we make our districts more inclusive and more equitable, right? So we want to revisit those forms. We want to look at, why certain places were made districts. Here in Alexandria, our two historic districts that the Board of Architectural Review have purview over were both created for very different reasons, right? Old and historic was a lot more about preserving the historic architecture, whereas the Parker Gray district was more about preserving the neighborhood and the community that lived there. So we have to think about that, and we need to come back and maybe revise it. Right now, as a BAR, when we're evaluating properties, we have a period of significance. Well, maybe that needs to change, right? Maybe it's time to relook at that and see if we need to pull it forward to think about more of our recent past. And then again, like I already mentioned, going out in the community and finding these stories, making these partnerships. And I think Jaqueline's going to talk a little bit more about that in her section after me. And then this was from a lecture that I attended that was put on by the Potomac Valley American Institute of Architects chapter. And it wasn't specifically related to architecture, but it was talking about diversity and inclusion and equity and justice principles in general. And I want to put this up here because I think that it's really important that we need to think about specific words and how we use our words and what those words mean, and to understand that we live in a society, right? So if you look at my third bullet there, you can't expect to swim in the dirty water of social identity and bias and expect to stay clean. So we all have bias, right? We all have prejudice, and we need to understand it. We need to recognize it, and then we need to figure out how we can use that to help us move forward, or to move past, right? And then becoming an ally is also really important. And that's what we're doing here in preservation, is we're becoming allies with our groups that are historically underrepresented to bring them up to the forefront. So of course, we want some actionable items, right? So what do? Well, we read as much as we can. We attend as many conferences as we can. We take part in these hard discussions. Even if we don't know what to say, we still try. We still say something, because, you know, saying nothing is still saying something. We want to discuss these topics with other people. And then of course we want to participate, which, you know, hopefully you all will do with us here when we get to the sort of the panel discussion Q&A portion. So I want to end with this quote, which I thought was really powerful. Diversity and inclusion are really about dismantling the specific ways in which we have operated that are detrimental to everybody. I feel like this is the crux of this movement, and we really, really need to move forward from here. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Purvi. Our final speaker for the evening is Jaqueline Tucker. Excuse me. Jaqueline is an innovative servant leader with a heart for civic engagement, community uplift, policy, and inclusive multiracial democracy. Jaqueline is the City of Alexandria's first race and social equity officer and comes to the role as a former educator who witnessed the injustices of systemic inequity firsthand in her Houston, Texas classroom. Tucker leads the city government's race and social equity commitment, All Alexandria, and is building a framework to ensure policy decisions advance race and social equity for all Alexandria residents. She collaborates with city departments, employees, and community stakeholders to ensure Alexandria becomes a more equitable community. Jaqueline will examine ways to operationalize diversity and equity in Alexandria. Jaqueline, it's all yours.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you all for having me tonight, talking about a very important topic for all of us, and really to the commitment for race and social equity. I just want to start there because not everybody truly understands what that means and what all of Alexandria is meant to or attempting to achieve. So first, our vision is that we would have a city where we're all embraced for who we are. We're able to thrive and reach our highest potential. That means that we're removing barriers to full participation and belonging in life and culture. Often you'll hear us talk really explicitly about race, but we're really talking about all Alexandrians and the diversity of our city. So that means all races, all abilities, all ages, all countries of origin, all immigration statuses, all ethnicities, all genders, all sexual orientations, all religious affiliations, and all residents. The ultimate goal of our work is to reduce and eliminate disparities and inequities experienced by all residents, but especially those in communities of color and other groups who have been historically and systemically marginalized. And our commitments in doing that are to center race and how it intersects with other areas of social marginalization. So how race intersects with gender, class, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, ability, immigration status, religious affiliation. Our second commitment is to understand and embrace the truth of our history and how that influences our current circumstances and the inequities that we see today. And then lastly is to build shared leadership and responsibility so that race and social equity is everyone's role. Not just my job, not just a city manager's job, not just city council's job, but all of our work, the community and the staff alike. So really where we find ourselves today is really talking about understanding and embracing the truth of our history. And as the panelists before me talked about the history and how historic preservation plays a variety of roles and how that is evolving over time, really I've been tasked with how do we operationalize those concepts? How do we take account to the historic inequities and bias and racism that is built into all of our systems and institutions, including historic preservation, and operationalize that. So from a perspective of business operations or how we do our work, how can we incorporate the principles of diversity and equity and inclusion into that work, into the work of historic preservation? So when we're talking about operationalizing, I think the most important thing or most important question that we should be asking ourselves is who is benefiting and who is being burdened. So whether that is choosing where a historic marker will go, or whether that's choosing what history is going to be preserved, whether that's choosing the mode or the method of how we tell history, we need to be asking ourselves who's benefiting and who's burdened. So that is the key question of operationalizing. And I borrowed this from Purvi. And it's funny when you kind of do these panels, the evolution of kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the terminology that we use is happening rapidly. And so justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion is something that I've borrowed from Purvi, and I think I will continue to use. So when I was thinking about historic preservation and operationalizing, there are a couple of things that came up. And so the first is examining and exploring Alexandria's code, right? Really thinking about the regulations in the code, what we're prioritizing when we're talking about preservation, what the law is essentially telling us is important to preserving, how we'll preserve it, is something that we have to do when we're thinking about operationalizing, actually looking at the law and the policy. Who is the law benefiting and who is the law burdening? And thinking of, in that same vein, the relationship to power, right? The relationship to history and the relationship to decision-making. And if we think about who drafted the code, when the code was drafted, we might get some of those Eurocentric things coming up again, as Purvi mentioned, and really the value of what is preserved and what is not preserved and how it is preserved will come out in our regulations and code. So really an examination of our regulations and code. What's important to us now? How has this evolved over time? And how does it show up in our current context is an important part of operationalizing justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion when we're talking about historic preservation. Another way that we can think about operationalizing is thinking about the makeup of our boards and commissions. What are their functions and what are their roles? How diverse are they? Are we creating space, time, and opportunity for diverse populations to participate in all of our boards, but especially our boards in Alexandria related to historic preservation? So Historic Alexandria Resource Commission, as well as BAR, thinking about what their role and what their function is, and really thinking how city council nominates boards in total is a major consideration when we're thinking about operationalizing equity in our city. Boards and commissions really set the tone and the vision for what we want to see and achieve. And so again, when we're thinking about the notion in the relationship to power and decision-making, we need to be thinking about how diverse these entities are. We need to be thinking about something like meeting times. We need to be thinking about compensation. These are often volunteer positions, and we need to be thinking about expertise and really how we define expertise and how we define the credentials that we believe or have historically believed are necessary to participate on boards and commissions. The third thing is that we would take on data-driven approaches and that we would be accountable. And so what I mean there is if we think about the Office of Historic Alexandria, if we think about the museums that we have, the many museums that we have around the city and the historic sites, we need to be thinking about the diversity of those offices. We need to be thinking about the diversity of the staff members. We need to be thinking about the diversity of the stories that we tell, right? My mom actually works, she is a historian by training, and she is retired. And she actually works at a plantation, a Smith plantation in Georgia. And prior to her arrival, the only story that was told was the story of the slave owners, right? And now she has done significant history about telling the story of the enslaved persons that are living there. So really thinking about how the stories are told, who's telling the stories at our historic sites is a way to really take into account the totality of how history is told. I think another way is to think about programming. How are we targeting programming? Who is it targeting to? Who is it targeted to? Who's actually attending the programming? How accessible is the programming, right? And who's involved in telling those stories when we have programs. But the accountability piece is that we would have some function or mechanism built into those programs where we're actually able to evaluate how successful they are, or we're actually evaluating who's attending and if they've learned something new, right? We have a tendency to just kind of go through work and just do the job and not actually take into account if it's really having the desired impact that we would like to have. So evaluation of participation, and I think another important part about being data-driven is thinking about the pipeline. We know a lot of historians of color and from historically marginalized groups, but we don't often see them when we think about preservation or if we think about architecture. So the diversity of the field, how can we enhance pipelines? How can we create mentorship opportunities? How can we really create representation that matters across the board and creating an environment that is sustainable in doing that? So thinking about that is an important part of being data-driven and accountable. Those are statistics and data that we have and that we can track. And so that will help us to have a spirit of continuous improvement when we're talking about operationalizing justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. The fourth point is to follow the money. What projects are priorities for us, right? What do we think is most important? Where's that money going? What are the types of projects? Where are they community-based? What are the community's priorities? Thinking about procurement. So if we're talking about preservation of physical space, but also of culture, who's telling those stories? Are they being compensated, and how are they being compensated for doing that? Right? If we're thinking about physical preservation, who has the skill set to do that? And are we really thinking about small women and minority-owned businesses who are able to do that work, or are we sticking to this kind of the same script of people who have always been in the history of the business of preservation? We can think about grant making, who's making the grants or how we're making grants, right? Really thinking about where the money is going and thinking about the commission of projects, right? When we think about preservation, oftentimes there's a component of us creating something new in order to preserve the past. When we're talking about those commissions, are we really thinking about the diversity of perspective persons who are going to be offering that? The fifth thing is understand the value of holistic history. So Purvi talked a lot about not just physical space and building, but the culture, right? Storytelling, right? We need to have that holistic approach to history. We need to be telling all sides of the story, and we need to be thinking again about the modes and the means that we're doing that. So having that holistic view allows us to create and understand the complexity of who we are as people and who we are as a nation and who we are as a city. And telling that story helps us to kind of move forward into the vision of the future. So that's critically important for us to have that holistic view. And then the last thing is for us to be creative. And authentic in our relationships and accessibility with diverse communities. I can be honest, and I would say, but for my mom, I don't think history in our neighborhood or our city would be something that I would be engaged in. But really, there are deep stories that are not heard, and so we have to create and continue to build authentic relationships with diverse communities to hear their stories, right? To see the places that they value and understand what it is that we should be trying to preserve. I think Purvi also shared with us an example of, I think it was Tacoma, Washington, and how they engage with their community. And the speaker said, I would never say historic preservation when I'm talking about with the community, because that's not an accessible language. Right? That's not something that is related to them. What people can tell you is their stories and their experiences, right? They can tell you the significance of that building on their street, right? So those are the things that we have to think about when we're talking about authentic relationships. And another example that she also shared was having a poetry slam, right? Thinking about the unique and creative ideas and ways we can engage our community in different places and locations to really celebrate who we all are and to celebrate who we all want to be. So those are some of the principles of operationalizing. I think really thinking about our practices and our policies and how we can incorporate some of these concepts as we move forward and think about the role of preservation in the city of Alexandria.
Thank you, Jacqueline. And I'll ask our panelists to turn their cameras on as well. So thank you to this distinguished group of panelists. Always fascinating. I've heard a few of these bits and pieces before, but every time I hear them, they get better and more interesting. So I think we're gonna actually change directions a little bit tonight. I said at the beginning that we were gonna take questions from the chat, but I think we've got an intimate enough group here tonight. And you know, one of the things I think I heard from a lot of people talking tonight was about community. And engaging with community, and that this should be more of a discussion than it is kind of a presentation. So we're going to change this up a little bit. We are going to, I think, and Lauren can correct me if I'm wrong here, we're going to change everyone over so that they can ask questions directly if they like. So you'll have two different options for ways to ask questions. You can raise your hand and we will unmute you and you can ask the question in person, or if you would prefer, you are more than welcome to use the chat function as we discussed earlier. We'll remind you, if you ask your question in person, just remind you that this is being recorded. So, you know, behave yourself. Not that I think anyone here would not. All right, so let's see, as they are getting put in here. So I'm going to start us off here with a question that kind of links us to the rest of Historic Preservation Month. And I'm just gonna kick this out to the group here as our attendees become panelists as that process works. So, over the course of the last month, we've talked a lot about preservation of the built environment. And this is all for the panelists here, what do the buildings that have been preserved and those that have been lost, what do those things say about us as a community? And just whomever would like to jump in first.
So I can start since I've been, you know, on the board for a while and I've seen a lot of different things. And I think that, you know, only recently have we really tried to start thinking more about the cultural values of some of our buildings, because a lot of times people will look at a building and they'll say, that's a really ugly building. Why are we saving it? It's an ugly building, you know, and they're not thinking about other parts of it, like who lived there, why is it there, you know, what was the purpose of that building, and maybe even things like what, you know, maybe it's ugly, but maybe the way that it was built was interesting. And I'm specifically thinking about the Ramsey homes because that is something that has always stuck with me for a long time, is that, you know, those buildings, a lot of people thought they were ugly. A lot of people thought they weren't worth preserving. And they had their own unique history that unfortunately is now gone. And it was an important piece because it was not only, you know, custom built for a specific community. It was, you know, African Americans who were working towards the World War II effort. So it was built for a minority community, or a non-majority community, I should say. And they were built with a very interesting construction method, which we didn't have anywhere else. So, you know, I think that we need to reevaluate. And I think that one, I don't want to say that, like, you know, maybe that was Alexandria's, like, I don't know, like major moment or something, but I think that it's something that we need to pivot from now and think about more about the histories in our buildings and not just the physical architecture of them when we're trying to save them like that. And we don't have a lot of those opportunities, so I think we need to really grab every one that we get. So.
Thank you, Purvi. Any panelists like to jump in, or time to move on?
And Purvi, as always, is on spot on right there. And you're right in that speaking of what Jacqueline was talking about, the systems we have and the structures we have and the guidelines we have are all directed toward physical stuff related to some sort of architectural characteristic. And you know, Purvi, you just said it was ugly. Well, maybe not to someone else in terms of the cultural, you know, background kind of thing, because we all fall into that trap. You know, we were trained that brutalism is brutalism. It even is called brutalism, you know, but it's ugly inherently. And Well, not everybody thinks that. And so, we want to make sure that we're not making uninformed decisions about what's important about the past. And I think that's where you're getting at, is that if we don't have the whole story, then if we only have the architectural details about a particular property and don't have the social details, the cultural details and such, then there's a good chance that we might tear down a building by mistake, or allow an addition to go forward by mistake, or a new development to go forward that would not value those intangible qualities.
That's very true.
All right, thank you. So let's see. Look and see if we have any hands up. I don't see any hands up. If anyone, again, like I said, if you'd like to ask your question in person, please raise your hand. So let's see. I got one here. I do have a couple in the chat here. Let's see. Actually, the one related to, I think Purvi was just talking about. This is from Al Cox. Purvi, preservationists did everything we could to preserve the Ramsey homes. It was a few of our political leaders that said they did not want to preserve a Jim Crow era facility.
It's true. And I mean, without turning this all into Ramsey homes, I mean, I think that it did in the end become a political issue. And I think that that was where the issue lied, is that those who, really understood the value of them wanted to keep one building. We were trying to keep one building, right? We understood the value of putting more affordable housing into our city. I do not want this to ever turn into a historic preservation versus affordable housing, right? Because again, it's about our community, right? And so preserving the one building would have kept the same number of units. So I think that in the end, that one was 100% political. I don't think it had anything to do with historic preservation at the end. That is my own personal opinion. It's way in the past it's done, so I think I can express that now publicly. And yes, Al's right, and he and I have talked about this too. And I think that it's definitely, and that's an issue though. I mean, we need to, definitely, we can't make because they were making preservation political, and it shouldn't be. I mean, I think it's one of those issues where we should all be trying to keep our community in a way that remembers everybody. And I don't want that to be a political thing. I don't want someone to say we're going to tear down this building because these 3 people don't want it, because then that's a political pandering, which I don't think should happen when it comes to historic preservation.
All right, thank you very much, Purvi. It looks like we have an in-person question here, which is Andrea Cochran-Tracy.
I know we're not supposed to turn this into a whole Ramsey homes discussion, but I mean, I do think, since this is sort of in the past, but it's the recent past, and it is that intersection of preservation and affordable housing, and gets to, I think one of the fascinating things I heard from several people of color after decisions were already made and the freight train had left the station, so to speak, was that I didn't know about the African-American story related to that site. And if I had known about that earlier, I might have had a different take on this. And I think that goes to what Jaqueline was talking about what are the stories that we are telling, and how are we telling them, and who's telling those stories? And most importantly, how are we reaching out to people to capture those stories before that memory is gone? In all communities and all different backgrounds here in our city. So just a thought.
That's actually a really good point. And right before they were torn down, there was a symposium that happened where we got to go on a tour of some of them. And it was at the Black History Museum, which happens to be right next to it. And there was a lecture given on oral histories that were done of the people who lived there. Now, a lot of it was more of an after the fact thing. And most of the history pieces were tied into the BAR hearings. So if, you didn't attend the BAR hearings, you weren't going to hear that. So I definitely agree that we need to find a better way to more widely distribute that information while these things are happening. And I'm hoping that project the way that it happened is a catalyst for us moving forward, that, you know, as these buildings are coming up and we're talking about whether to keep something or whether to demolish it, that part of that conversation is the history of the site and of not just the building itself, but what happened, what that site had even before the buildings that are there before. So, which
I think
actually
that-
ties into to your other comment that you had about the heritage and how we're trying to use the new site to better interpret what happened there before. So.
I think an important part of this is when we're talking about operationalizing, are our political leaders required to use a lens or a standard by which they're evaluating the importance of all things related to people who are historically marginalized or have been underrepresented? And historically, we have not done that. I think that is one of the goals of all Alexandria, is to really build that into all of our decision making. And so if we're able to do that successfully, we would have, again, that holistic, hopefully, view up front, whereby, you know, the community is weighing in, but that, you know, political leaders are being held to account for the totality of the circumstances, not just development or affordable housing, but really what is the cost benefit, or who's being burdened, or who's going to benefit ultimately from something like that, in all of our practices, but especially historic preservation, because that talks about what we value, right? And it's more than just, again, the physical space. It is the stories that are associated with it, and what are, you know, the potential alternatives or unintended consequences if we move forward with this decision without having those considerations in place.
All right, thank you. So we have several questions in our chat here. Let's just go from the top. How can preservation be balanced with competing equally important needs like housing, environmental restoration, transportation, et cetera?
I'll start with that one. I think that for years, the preservation community has been really hand in glove with the larger environmental movement. And frankly, preservationists could have learned a lot more lessons from the environmental community. And one of the things that's fascinating is how environmental justice develops as a concept and a process, and its relationship to the larger environmental world, and what happens in regard to that in the preservation community. And so, you know, that is something we don't talk about. You know, tearing down buildings cost us in terms of landfills. We do not, there's no calculation in that in our current systems. And there are all sorts of new ways we could be looking at the environmental impacts of demolition, of new construction, of all these things. And that's just not part of the systems that we have in the city yet.
Right, isn't the old saying, the greenest building is one that already exists?
That's what I was gonna say, right?
Sorry, Brittany.
It's a
not
true
that old of a
phrase.
saying.
I spent the 10 years that I worked in architecture before I moved over to technology. I worked, at a preservation firm, and I actually worked with the person who coined that phrase. And, it's definitely important. I mean, I spent many hours calculating the existing building LEED credit for a building once, and it takes a lot of time, but you think about, it's all about that embodied energy, right? Like the energy that's another one of those terms, right? That people are like, what does that mean? What's embodied energy? Well, it's the energy that it takes to make something, right? So when you make a brick, right, it requires a lot of energy to make a brick, right? And so if you leave that brick in place, all that energy that it took to make that brick, right, is not wasted. But as soon as you tear down that and you throw it in the landfill, now you've pretty much thrown away that energy. So it's kind of the idea that we've spent all this energy, this environmental energy, to make this thing. And if we can reuse it some way, that's actually better for the environment. Preservation and like John said, preservation and sustainability have been hand in hand forever. I mean, I think that it's, they're two, but I think that the other things that we balance are things like housing. And I actually think that Alexandria, at least as long as I've been living here since 2005, I feel like has more or less done a pretty good job of balancing the needs of housing with the needs of historic preservation, because I think that we have enough diversity in our building stock and in our neighborhoods that we were able to make those priorities pretty well. Like, we got 50, we went from, what was it, Ramsey was 15 units to 53 units now. So, you know, that's really great. And I think where the one that's where the carpenter shelter is, that's another whole set of affordable units there too. So I think, and the whole Old Town Commons added more affordable units too when they built the mixed income from where the James Bland used to be. So I think that we're, you know, we're balancing it, but we do need to, I think a little bit more about, maybe it doesn't need to be all of it. Maybe we can find that balance of keeping some of it to maintain some of that history, because people have said, well, you can tear down Ramsey, you can put up a plaque. And I'm like, really? Like, that's kind of the face I make when someone like, well, put up a plaque. Well, okay, but the physical building makes people think a lot more than a plaque, right? And so the idea is that you want to have something there that will cause people to pause and to think and to ask a question and to engage.
So we're getting close on our time, but there are a couple of interesting questions in the chat that I'd like to try to get it to as quickly as we can.
Yeah, I'm happy to go over to, I don't know if others to get the questions.
Sure. And I think this one, Jacqueline, I'd like to get your input on this one. It's an interesting question. This question says that I realize it's cyclical, but while we are trying to represent underrepresented communities in our narratives, how do we also attract underrepresented professionals into the field? Do we need to be going to high schools, HBCUs? Are we going to be able to attract people to a field which is steeped in a framework which begets change, uses bureaucracy to continue telling white, wealthy, male, straight stories, and also doesn't pay well?
Well, the unfortunate thing is I think most institutions promote that narrative of white, wealthy, straight Christian men. So that is something that we have to confront and interrupt and dismantle in all of our institutions and all of our fields of practice. I think the pay is an interesting concept because when there are fields that don't pay well, and they're related to sort of being highly credentialed and being subject matter experts, it's more difficult for people of color or low income or underrepresented communities to be a part of that. And in that same vein, because they're not a part of it, that representation and sort of mentorship and even knowledge that this is a field that you can pursue is not there. So it really does take from an early age, whether it be, you know, elementary field trips or whether it be actually working in high school specifically on these ideas to recruit, right? It's about establishing that pipeline and making sure that there's not only that subject matter expertise and knowledge that's being shared, but also that the financial support is there from that early age, but also throughout their educational career and experience. It's not enough to just get underrepresented groups in the door, but we have to make sure that they stay in the door. And that's where that inclusion comes in. It's not just the diversity. Diversity is a significant part of it, right? The differing viewpoints, the different backgrounds that we want to have in the field. But it's also the inclusion. Do you feel welcome? Do you feel like you can show up as your true self? Or are you trying to assimilate again to that standard, as you mentioned, of being white and male and wealthy, right? And is that field is it trying to, you know, understand and recognize its own kind of implicit biases that exist within it? And until that point, again, across all institutions, we have people of color who often don't feel included. We have historically marginalized groups who don't feel included, right? And so that's really something that we all need to be grappling with across the board. But it's important that we at least try. Don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Like, this is something that we recognize and acknowledge. And so we need to be thinking about the ways to operationalize or build in or create scholarships or opportunities even within our own community that are specific to this field, so that we are not representing underrepresented communities, but that underrepresented communities are representing themselves. That's really the goal of what we're trying to achieve.
And I actually have a couple of good resources specifically to that question if people are interested. So in my presentation, I mentioned dismantle preservation. So they had a conference last summer. There's another one coming up this July, the end of July. And if you just Google dismantle preservation, you're going to find it. And the person who runs it, her name is Sarah Marsam. She's amazing. She's outreached to so many people to get input. She's started a movement of only advertising preservation internships that are paid and only advertising them with the salary information. So it's, and there's a whole Facebook group, Historic Preservation Professionals, where these are posted also. So that's a resource. And then a resource for architects is there's actually an organization called NOMA, which is the National Organization of Minority Architects, and they are doing a lot to outreach to these more disadvantaged communities. So if you're interested in participating, there is a Northern Virginia chapter of NOMA. It's called VA NOMA that you can join. And then the dismantle preservation, I highly recommend that you check that out and look it up because the one that's coming up, it's only presentations by students. She intentionally said, I'm going to bring these young voices to the forefront. And so all the presentations, at least the last time I saw it, were only by students. So I think that, these sorts of grassroots organizations that are bringing these things up and starting to push these voices forward are really going to do, what Jaqueline was saying, bringing people who don't necessarily have a voice into having a voice in that way. So thank you, Laura, for posting those in the chat. I think there was actually was there one other?
If I might also, the scholarship foundation of Alexandria, that's those wonderful folks. Historic Alexandria Foundation has over the last several years presented a scholarship for a student from TC Williams who is going into architecture, architectural history, or archaeology, or whatever it might be. So that foundation part and giving part you can find that in your backyard.
Yeah.
So we've got, I think we'll take two more questions in here, and I also want to just read in. There's not really a question, but it's an interesting statement. So without beating a dead horse, Ramsey was an attempt to incorporate historic preservation into an affordable housing project and to save the embodied energy with units. There are other potential examples to do this in the future, and the continuation of this is the Black Elks Lodge at 227 North Henry and the Rooming House at 1033 Pendleton are potential housing preservation issues. So we do have two more questions. I think we're just about out of time, but let's hit these two last questions because these are interesting and it's a fascinating discussion tonight. First is, in reevaluating the city's histories and preservation to be more inclusive, how do you propose this process takes place? I'm excited by the prospect of telling more diverse stories, but I'm curious about possible best practices to make that reevaluation happen. And I guess that's really up for any of you.
I guess I can start, and this really ties in, I think, to Jaqueline's role here in the city, is to, John and I sit on the Board of Architectural Review, so we have this one specific role related to that. But I think that we as a board are rethinking what our position is and how we can expand that out more widely. I actually think that this last year of having all of our meeting on Zoom has made it so that more people can participate in the historic preservation conversation. We've had meetings, some of our meetings where we've had like 30 speakers because everyone can just kind of log in from wherever they are and they can, express their views and thoughts on a particular project. So I think that that's part of it is making sure that we're allowing as many avenues for participation as possible. So I'm hoping that, once we can actually all be back in the same room together, there's still going to be that Zoom option so that folks who, have mobility issues or, childcare concerns or things like that can still log in and have their voices be heard in front of the board. And I think that part of it is we have to work together to outreach to these communities and do these fun events. I would really love to do the poetry slam idea. Like that when I saw that Tacoma, Washington did like a youth poetry slam, and I thought it was amazing. I thought it was a great way to bring the younger generation in and to really hear their voices and what they think of their neighborhood and what their history is, right? I want to hear what your history is because your history is our history. It's all together. And so, I'm asking any of you who are out there. If you have connections to any of these organizations to help us partner, you know, reach out, and we want to try to put together some things. Hopefully, you know, we've hit more than 50% vaccinated in the city. So I'm hoping that come the fall, we can actually all be in person together and actually, you know, be a community in real life and not on a screen and do some of these things. It takes all of us, you know. If you have an idea, share it.
If I can, a couple things too. One of the things that I think if we're going to reconstruct preservation in the city, we're going to have to deal with the fundamental flaw or the fundamental tension between the focus on tourism and the focus on residents. And we've seen this recently in a lot of cases before the bar, where there's the mantle we have, all the guidance we have is focused on tourism and what tourists might experience. And yet we also hear from residents who are saying, well, what about us? And I think that there's a real, if we're really talking about residents in the city and folks that live here or that have lived here, you need to think about the quality of life for those residents in the broader sense. So environment, history, all those things. And perhaps not worry too much about the tourist, or think about residents first rather than tourists. And that may, you know, us versus outsiders. That may change if we look at that across the board in the city. That would certainly restructure the way we think about the environment that we're building for our children.
All right, so in response, I think, to one of Purvi's comments, we have a comment in the chat that says, Carlisle House is having a poetry slam of sorts with people of color on Juneteenth. Come check it out. So that sounds exciting. All right, so we'll do one last question here tonight, and then we'll let everyone get on with their evenings. As fascinating as this discussion has been. John, I think I'm gonna ask you to just start on this one, just because. Many people believe that historic buildings are large single-family homes on large plots of land which represent historic white wealth. How can we reframe this language to show people that the 1930s garden apartments, 1950s housing projects, and early 1900s apartment buildings, which are in disrepair and therefore are affordable, are also historic buildings which are housing our low and mixed income families?
Well, and I think one of the other issues that we need to think about seriously is embracing the 20th century history of Alexandria. There are lots and lots, as we just heard, lots of resources out there that have the potential for adaptive use in many, many different ways that happen to be from the 20th century, and they're not as appreciated. You know, I happen to think the most important building in the Commonwealth of Virginia is Gerald Ford's house, which is a mid-century split level out there in Clover, for a variety of reasons. I also think that there are indeed resources that we could be looking at from the 20th century. The history of the civil disobedience in the community is something we could look at seriously. But we have to take that effort, and we have to actually do it, and somebody has to make the effort.
All right, well, I think we've hit the end of our questions. I'll ask the panelists, do anybody have any parting thoughts before we go on for our evenings?
Thank you, everybody, for your questions. I posted in the chat a link to a website that I'm trying to maintain related to diversity and inclusion issues and initiatives. So please check it out. And if you have anything to add, please feel free to share it over. And I'll add it to the list. It really is supposed to be a resource. So please check it out.
Thank you. Thank
And
you.
thanks to Bill for running the show.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you so much to our distinguished panelists here this evening. It's been a fascinating discussion. I'd like to go on for another hour if we could, but Jaqueline Tucker, excuse me. Good to meet you. I think you're new to this group, but I think it's going to be exciting. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Purvi and John, it's been known you guys for a long time, and thank you very much for tonight. It's been fascinating, and I look forward to more of this. All right, everyone, have a good evening tonight, and have a safe and happy Memorial Day.